It's the Fitness Lab Pittsburgh podcast, a new episode every week. A podcast about movement, part of making your life complete. Fitness Lab Pittsburgh, aka FitLabPGH, brings you interviews with people in the Pittsburgh area who understand movement is part of what makes life complete. Looking for a new movement idea or just want to hear interesting stories about people who make movement a priority? This is the podcast for you. Whether you consider the gym, dojo, or fitness studio your third place, or just want to learn more about movement, activity, and fitness to enhance your life, give FitLabPGH a listen. We interview locals in the Pittsburgh area who make Pittsburgh a great place to move. Subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Google Play, or check out our website for other subscription options. Subscribing is free and gives you notifications when we release new episodes. Each podcast episode will be long enough to pique your interest and short enough to hold your attention. Have an idea for an episode? Know somebody we should interview? Or just want to connect with us? Drop us an email, fitlabpgh@gmail.com, or follow us on Twitter or Instagram at FITLABPGH. Already a fan of FitLabPGH? Check out our sister podcast, Moving to Live. Moving to Live is a podcast for movement professionals and amateur aficionados. Moving to Live offers weekly interviews with movement professionals featuring topics from career development to coaching tips and education resources to advice for parents of student athletes. We look forward to hearing from you, and we hope you enjoy our next interview, starting now. FitLabPGH is back with another podcast interview. Just as a reminder, if you're listening to this podcast, please consider giving us a review. Also, we rely on listeners sometimes or previous guests to get interviews. And in this case, today's guest came compliments of a recommendation from Menachem Brody, Human Vortex Training. We've interviewed him both for FitLab Pittsburgh and for Moving to Live. We'll have links to those episodes in the show notes, and check out his website. I know he's starting out with a strength training program that's available for cyclists that's pretty good. So give that a listen. And thanks, Menachem, for suggesting this. Today we are with Rich Walters. We are in Squirrel Hill, I believe. Usually I get my neighborhoods messed up. And Rich is a personal trainer who has an interesting story about how he got into personal training, and on a more serious topic about the fact how in 2013 he suffered a stroke, and since then has devoted his life towards training and raising awareness for strokes and stroke recovery. So, Rich, thanks for opening your garage gym to us and talking to FitLabPGH.
Well, thanks for coming all the way from where? Finleyville? Finleyville, yeah.
The question would be, have you ever heard of that?
I've heard of it because I've heard of Cal U.
There we go. So my first question I always like to ask people for FitLab Pittsburgh is, are you a Pittsburgh native? And if you're not, what brought you here? If you are, why did you decide to stay here?
I am a Pittsburgh native, and I decided to stay here because this is where I got married, and this is where our family lives, and this is where I make a living.
The interesting stories we have from people of why they stay in Pittsburgh or why they get there. I'm always interested when we interview people for FitLab Pittsburgh. Were you an active kid, or was active working as a personal trainer, being active, is that something you discovered in adulthood?
I was active, but I wasn't balanced. I wished when I was a kid that I would have done strength training and other things, more regimented kind of activities.
And were you in organized sports as a kid, or just one of those kids where mom and dad said, get out of the house and go play and don't come back until dinner time?
Sort of a combination. I wasn't actually in organized sports officially, but we did sort of have organized sports groups when I was a kid.
And you graduate from high school, you go to college. Are you still active when you're in college?
Yeah, that's where I started doing strength training. And my first experience with that was at a YMCA, and I had no idea how to use the equipment. And I went into the leg room. They had two separate rooms. and I laid under the leg press, and it was one of these old leg presses from, I don't know, the 1920s, and there was no weight on there, and I laid underneath of it, and I pushed up, and it crushed me. I was like in an umbilical position for about 20 minutes. And then I hobbled out of there, and my friend was in the other room. And I said to my friend, I had one hell of a leg workout.
And what was it, or what was the impetus when you were in college to consider or to start strength training?
Just to look good and feel good. I think that's a common thing for teenagers and college kids.
And I know I'm not breaking any secrets. You mentioned before we started recording, when you were 61 a few years ago, you suffered a stroke. So when you were in college, that was not when the colleges and universities had the big fancy homages to fitness with wellness centers. This was really even a YMCA kind of underground, not in a bad way, but you had to really know what you were looking for in order to find a facility.
Yeah, that's true. The first facility I went to when I was about 12 or 13 years old it was called the Young Men's and Hebrew Institute, which now became the city schools department. It's on the corner of right across from the museum in Oakland, if you're familiar with that. And Bruno Sammartino used to work out in there, and all these big guys. And we weren't really allowed in there, but we peeked in, and we went over to the weight bench. And at that time, they would smoke cigarettes and put the cigarettes on the corner of the weight bench. And these huge guys, they didn't say anything to us. And so that was my first experience in a weight room.
So clearly the experience of being crushed by the leg press machine didn't make you stop. How did you progress from there? Did you get somebody to show you? Did you, I know this is dating both of us, go to the library and find a book rather than going on the internet, or just kind of watch people and kind of mimic them? How did you progress from that with the strength training?
Well, at first I just kind of mimicked people. Unfortunately, there wasn't the internet, and there's so much that I'm learning today that I wish I knew about 20 years ago. Even when I became a personal trainer, I don't really feel like I knew that much about strength training, just gradually learned it over time. It was sort of a big secret at that time. It was sort of like this cult, and you had to go up to somebody, and it was sort of embarrassing, go up to them and say, well, how do you do this? Or what kind of diet do you follow? And so it was very secretive.
And it was also the sort of thing that many people would say, well, why are you doing that? You don't need to get stronger. That's dangerous. You're going to hurt yourself.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So you become a little bit more knowledgeable, and you mentioned you became a personal trainer in
1998.
1998. So you had at least one career prior to that. So what did you major in college and grad school, or what was your career path before becoming a personal trainer?
Well, my major, I actually have a master's degree in mental health counseling. And but then I spent 20 years in corporate America as a district manager.
I'm so sorry.
For a financial services company. And then actually my neighbor, he used to live a few houses down the street, used to go to the gym every morning at 5 o'clock. And I thought, well, that's a perfect time for me because I had children at that time and I wouldn't feel guilty about going to work out. And I started working out with my neighbor, and he was very knowledgeable, and he had all these routines developed, and that's how I really got started. And that was prior to 1998. And then in 1998, I said, I want to do this for a living. It would be great to get paid to work out. And that's how I changed careers, and I went completely from a suit and tie, and I put on my tennis shoes and my sneakers, and my daughter particularly freaked out because she was used to her daddy coming home in a suit and tie all the time, and there I was in sweatpants and tennis shoes.
What were your family's and friends' reactions when you said, I'm chucking corporate America and I'm going to work as a personal trainer?
Well, especially my daughter was freaked out. My wife was actually very supportive of the idea, even though it was a big pay cut, because she knew that I was pursuing something that I would love, and corporate America just got to the point where it was very stressful and I was ready to pop my blood vessels out.
I'm curious, are your kids or your wife, do they work out also?
I try to get my wife to work out. We at least try to take a date walk every night, which is I recommend that for everybody to do that. It's very, in my opinion, very healthy for your relationship. And you get to spend some quality time together, and it's free. And my kids, depending on where they're at, because they all have kids of their own. I have a lot of grandkids. So sometimes it's hard for them to find time to work out. But my older son is very into running a lot, and my middle son tries to at least do some working out, and my daughter also tries to do some working out.
I'm curious, with the daily walk with your wife, is this rain or shine, winter, summer, or just when the weather's good?
Well, ideally it's rain or shine kind of thing. We try to get out at least every night.
I tell people who say, I don't like to go out when the weather is bad, I tell them, get a dog, because that's when the dog wants to go.
Right.
The times that I'm least likely to want to go out and run or hike, or when my two Labradors say, it's 20 degrees out and snowing, we'd love to be outside. And you find once you're out for 15 minutes or so, it really isn't that bad. It's actually quite enjoyable.
Oh, yeah. It's awesome.
What about your colleagues at your white collar or your friends when you said, I'm giving up the corporate America life, I'm going to work as a personal trainer? What was there? Because at this point in time, you had kids, you'd spent time in corporate America. It wasn't like you were 24, 25 saying, this just isn't for me, I'm going to switch careers. You were already older and established in a career.
Right. I think they kind of thought it was kind of cool, And what I did was I started out on Monday as a personal trainer, and then the rest of the week I was in corporate America. And then it became Tuesday, and then finally it was just Friday. And I had to make that final decision. And I remember the last meeting I went to, we had a dress code. And we were allowed to take our suit jackets off in the meeting, but under my white shirt was a big T-shirt in black that said Rich Walters Personal Training Services with my phone number. And the senior vice president comes walking around the meeting, and he looks at my T-shirt with scorn. And he's like, Walters, what are you up to? And I said, damn, this is my last day.
I think I know the answer to this, but do you miss it at all?
No, not one iota.
Thinking back to when you were in college, if you knew then what you know now, would you have tried to figure out a way from the start to go into personal training or some sort of health and wellness as a career right from the beginning?
Yeah, but I would want to pursue like some sort of a degree like what you have, because I don't have a related degree. Like I said, my degrees are in psychology and mental health counseling, which helps a lot because the mental part is a very, very big part of this. Big, huge.
And it's actually probably the last 10 years or so they've gotten into It's always been a huge emphasis on the science of coaching and the science of personal training. Now they're talking about the art, and there are coaching programs where there's a lot of concentration on making sure that the athletes and the individuals have good mental health practices. And very often with the personal trainer or the strength coach, they're the person who sees the individual the most on a regular basis, 2 or 3 times a week for an hour, 2 hours at a time. So often if they have that knowledge like you have just because of your degrees, you can recognize things because you see the person on a regular basis.
Right, but also when I say mental, well, you said you were into the hex bar, which is if I had to pick one exercise for weight training, this would be it, because it works almost every muscle in your body. But to perform this, I'm trying to get the Guinness World Book of Records for this. They rejected my first request, but I'm going to...
So Rich is talking about the hex bar deadlift. We'll have a picture, I think.
Sometimes they call it the trap bar deadlift.
Or trap bar. So what is the Guinness Book of World Records that you're trying to get?
Well, there is no Guinness Book of World's record for this lift. Okay? But they told me that I had to do at least 800 pounds because they saw somebody on the internet doing 800 pounds. But the fact is that I'm a 66-year-old stroke survivor. So I think even if I would do, let's say, 400 or 500 pounds, I think that would be pretty amazing.
So you give up corporate America, you start working as a personal trainer in 1998. I'm assuming this allows you more evidence or more time to say, okay, I need to work out on a regular basis. There's no excuse because I need to practice what I preach.
Right.
And you mentioned that one of the things that's really a passion in your life is giving hope to stroke patients and people who have suffered strokes. So one would think, if they're listening, saying, well, he's a personal trainer, he probably watches what he eats, he's probably very conscientious. You just said you took a regular walk with your wife and you did other things. Many people are going to listen to that and say, well, he's not a candidate to have a stroke, and yet you had a stroke. Kind of talk about that. Was there any warning signs that you, looking back, going, man, I should have picked up on that, or was it just sudden?
No, and it was actually pretty embarrassing for me because in my neighborhood, I'm sort of a symbol of, I used to have it on my car, Get Fit with Rich. And, in my neighborhood, it's like, even if they weren't working out with me, they'd be like, yeah, get fit with Rich. And so one day, it was actually a week before I was scheduled to run the Pittsburgh half marathon. I've run a whole bunch of half marathons and one full marathon. I was sitting in my backyard, and it was very early in the morning. And I said, I need to take a shower to get ready for work. And I felt kind of weird. And I started stumbling around. And actually, my grandson, his first name is Ashi. He saved my life because he was 5 years old. And my wife usually sleeps in. This was on a Sunday morning. My wife usually sleeps in on a Sunday morning. My grandson calls my wife and wakes her up. And I came into the bedroom, and she looked at me, and it was like a stroke commercial. I don't know if you've ever heard of a stroke commercial. And she said, "You're having a stroke!" And I couldn't talk. I literally lost my ability to speak. And I'm thinking in my head, but I wasn't really talking. And I'm thinking in my head, I got to take a shower in my head. And I went into the bathroom to take a shower, and my wife said, "I'm calling the paramedics." And I'm thinking, I can't talk. No! I'm not having a stroke. Just tired. I'll wake up after I take my shower. And she called the paramedics, and to me, they look like big police guys. And they came in the bathroom, and I was still strong. So I actually slammed the door shut on them. It's like, how dare you come into the bathroom while I'm taking a shower? And then my wife unlocked the door, and I gradually got weaker and weaker. And they took me downstairs. It was very, very embarrassing because here I was, the symbol of get fit with Rich and this healthy lifestyle. And I had done strength training and running and biking. And, I ate pretty well, not 100%.
Was there a family history of strokes?
No. So, like I was telling you before the interview, strokes do not discriminate. Little babies have strokes. Athletes have strokes. One of the Penguins had a stroke. This Olympic athlete I just read about had a stroke. He was a big runner in the Olympics. Every 10 seconds globally, somebody is having a stroke, and it's not just elderly people. Young people have strokes, bodybuilders have strokes, so I don't know what to tell you.
Your wife calls the paramedics after you fight them off. They subdue you, and I'm saying that jokingly. You get to the hospital. How long was it before you realized yourself that, I had a stroke?
I never thought of myself as having a stroke. I viewed it as a setback. But I did have one experience, and maybe it just lasted for a few seconds or a few minutes. And I was laying there in the bed, and I was totally paralyzed on my right side. I couldn't walk, and my right arm had popped out of my shoulder. And it atrophied immediately, like it was like a little worm. And I had done bodybuilding for 20 years prior to that. My arm popped out of my shoulder. My hand swelled up, and they call it spastic. I couldn't open my hand. I had no strength in my right hand, and I couldn't speak, and my memory was shot. And for a couple minutes, I felt like giving up. Now, this is what I'm talking about, mental. So we can learn a lot from me, from a stroke survivor, because it's a great feat to overcome a stroke. A great feat. Takes a lot of discipline and determination and persistence and frustration. One of the things that gave me hope was there's a famous book about strokes written by a man by the name of Dr. Levine. He wrote Stronger After a Stroke. And he said two things that gave me a lot of hope. He said the most important thing for a stroke survivor to do is weight training and walking. I said, well, that's what I love to do. This is right up my alley. This is going to be fun. And then he said the next thing is you got to train like an athlete because it's all mental and it's a lot of repetition. And the thing about a stroke is that if you understand what happens, you realize there are amazing possibilities. The average stroke kills 2 billion neurons in our brain. But there's a quadrillion, trillion neuron connections available to rebuild your brain if you work at it. And so that also gave me a lot of hope.
So how soon were you able to start your rehabilitation, both from professionals doing it and from you taking your knowledge and saying, okay, this is what I was doing before. Maybe I need to adapt it or change it a little, but still do the same thing. You had the stroke. How long did it take before you were able to start doing something to start on recovery?
Well, the first thing is after I went into that brief state of depression, I don't know if it lasted for 30 seconds or a couple minutes, and I felt like just totally giving up. I gave myself this huge pep talk because I was used to giving pep talks from corporate America and pep talks from being in the fitness industry. And finally, at the end of my pep talk, I think this is a line from a movie, I said, I'm mad as hell, and I swung my affected leg. I was paralyzed. I swung my affected leg over the side of the bed, and I stood up, which is amazing. That was after 2 or 3 days in the hospital. And I stood up, and of course all the bells started going off, and the 3 nurses came rushing in, and I was still hooked up to all these IVs, but I stood up, and I was ready to go run the half marathon. And on Sunday, which was a week later, I got dressed, ready to go run the half marathon. And I put on my 5-finger shoes, which I was wearing at that time, and, my T-shirt, and I went walking down the hall. I was still crippled, and I still really couldn't talk very well. And my right arm was sort of flopping around, and there were 3 doctors that came walking down, the head doctor and 2 assistants. And I said, Doctor, I want to go run the... I slurred my speech. I said, Doctor, I want to go run the half marathon. I'll be right back. He didn't laugh. He just looked at me and he says, give it 3 months. Well, in 2014, 7 months later, mainly to give people hope and inspiration, I said, I want to do something amazing. So I signed up for the Polar Dash in Minneapolis, and it was 10 degrees below zero and 20 degrees below with the wind chill. And that's the fastest race I ever ran. I got a plaque champion. Now, of course, I was the oldest person in my age group, but still, I never ran that fast in my life. And that was... And I really did that to inspire other stroke survivors and also head injury survivors. One of my friends was injured on his bike, and it's a very similar thing. You're either injured from the outside or you're injured from the inside, but it's still an injury to your brain.
And I know one of the things they say with brain injuries, whether it's a stroke or whether it's because of a traumatic incident, is recovery is ongoing. It's not something that after 6 months or a year, 18 months, they say, well, Rich, that's all we can do for you. Live with it. It's something because everybody is an N of 1 and everybody's brain neurons work slightly differently. So now you're 4 years, 5 years after the stroke. Do you still see changes?
Well, let me answer your first question completely because I developed my own treatment plan. Okay. And I'm not dissing any of the rehab people, but because of my experience and I study a lot, I developed my own treatment plan, which consisted of 5 basic components. 1 was spiritual, 2 was mental, positive affirmations. That's why I wear this T-shirt. I am healthy and strong, and whatever I did today, I can do better tomorrow, better than best. So it's all mental. And yeah, the treatment plan is ongoing, but so is it for the civilians out there, for the healthy people. It's not like we can just give up on life. And that's what a lot of people do. They reach a certain phase of life and they give up, and then they become fat, and then they do become disabled, and they will end up in nursing homes eventually. So we have to take care of the quality of our life. So the first thing was spiritual. The second is mental, positive affirmations, visualizations. I never thought I would not recover from the stroke. I just viewed it as a setback. I was laying in bed and I said, great athletes have setbacks. I'm not a great athlete, but I am an athlete, and I'm going to recover from this. And I'm mad as hell. And I got up out of bed and I stood up. Now, everybody's situation is different, and I'm not judging other people, but that was my experience. And then the third thing is nutrition. No, I don't like to talk about nutrition because it's very controversial, and perhaps World War III will start over nutrition fights. But I did develop a nutrition plan for myself. My wife helped a lot. She likes to read, and we just set up this big chart. And I said, well, I got to do this. And we read a lot of books about it. And I developed a nutrition plan for myself, which I was on for about 3 years. Now I'm off of that, and I'm going to go back on to more of a bodybuilding nutrition plan, strength training nutrition plan. But that did work for me. Now, I can't say that the nutrition helped me recover. And then number 5 is staying active. So that includes strength training, aerobics, walking, running, whatever you can do, mowing the lawn. I remodeled my house. Any way you can stay active is very important.
It's interesting you say that. We recently interviewed Reed of Reed & Company down in Lawrenceville, and he talked about how growing up, his parents were very active because he grew up on an organic farm. So they didn't, quote unquote, work out. But when they weeded the vegetables for 6, 7, 8, 9 hours a day, and I know growing up on a farm and working landscape and working construction as a kid, it's not a quote unquote workout, but it is because you're doing hard physical labor.
Yeah, when I remodeled my basement, especially, that was because I had to rebuild the walls and carry a couple 100 pounds of cement up and down the steps, and that's a workout.
As somebody who's in the industry, the things that you've described to do to recover from a stroke sounds like what anybody who is healthy would want to do to maintain a high quality of life.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. It applies to civilians.
And I know that sometimes in the rehab world, people are used to dealing with patients who essentially show up and say, "Here I am, fix me."
Yeah, exactly.
What was their response to you when you came in and did what they told you to do and then said, and I'm doing this and this too? Did they say, "Rich, you're doing too much," or "Rich, listen to us, you don't know what you're doing"? Or did they say, "Go for it"?
Well, I think they kind of freaked out when they met me because, first of all, one day I was sitting in a wheelchair and they made me sit in this wheelchair. I was ready to walk and run actually by then. And they said, "You got to sit in this wheelchair," and I'm waiting there. My son was there, and it's like 15 minutes. I said, "The heck with this." So I got out of the wheelchair, and I saw they had like these steps that you could run up and down, and these different courses. So I said, "Why not?" Well, so I started running up and down the steps and doing the courses, and then they started to pay attention to me. And then I think it was my last day, or maybe the second to the last day, most of them were really afraid. Like, I probably have liability, like, don't do this, and you have to be careful going up those steps. And they were like holding on to me, and I was ready to run up steps. And so finally I got this last day, this kind of cool guy with tattoos on. His name was John. And he said, "Rich, let's see if you can run." I said, "Run?" I said, "I'll race you down this hall." And I did. I sprinted down the hall, and John had to grab me from the back. And my son-in-law was coming out of the bathroom, and he's like, "What's he up? What's Grandpa up to?" And I think it's all a matter of mental determination.
What about the physicians that you were working with? Were they supportive? Were they surprised? Or did they say, yeah, that's basically what we expected?
Well, again, I don't want to diss the physicians, but I'm going to do it anyhow. Okay, this is the first time publicly that I'm going to do this. I'm going to sort of euphemize it a little bit. But I was not very happy with the physicians. There was only one physician that actually saved my life, and the rest of them inadvertently probably tried to kill me. Not intentionally, but there was one resident who was going to prescribe a certain medication for me when I was in the hospital. And if my wife wouldn't have been there as an advocate, that definitely would have killed me. And then some of the recommendations that they gave me as far as medications, I went off of all of my medications. Now, I have to publicly say that I'm not giving medical advice to people, and I'm not giving rehab advice, and I'm not giving nutritional advice. I'm just sharing with you my personal story.
Your personal story as an N of one, making a decision for yourself, saying, if this works, I'm going to have a high quality of life. If it doesn't work and it kills me, I can live with that. Pun intended.
Yeah. Well, my friends and some of my clients, I have a good client who's a pharmacist, and some other client friends who are doctors, and they were telling me not to do this, that it's very dangerous. But here I am.
So now you're here 5 years later.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to get back to training clients after suffering the stroke?
On the 11th day. Now, I couldn't open the door, so I had to ask them to help me to open the door. I sort of made a joke about that. I said, let's see how much agility you have, and here's the keys. And I couldn't spot them at first on certain things because I thought it was too dangerous. So for a while, they were very nice to me, very loyal and helpful, and they did other exercises until I was able to strong enough to spot them.
And I know how some people can become very attached to their personal trainers and the people that they work with. Did you have any of your clients look at you and say, Rich, if you wanted a vacation, you should have gone to Florida instead of the hospital?
Well, I think they were all amazed that I came back so quickly, because I called them, and they were like, one of them said he bumped his head on a tree when I called him. He couldn't believe it, and because they all were aware of what happened to me and how massive it was. But again, it was just determination and persistence, and I think that's the key to everything in life. And the starting point, if I may, is I talked about our phenomenal potential, but I think the starting point is posture, believe it or not. So a lot of people have very poor posture because they're used to, that internal rotation and that forward head posture from looking at computers or working on their cell phones. And that puts their whole spine out of alignment. So the starting place to capitalize on that phenomenal potential is our posture, because our spine supports our head, When they say stand up straight, you really can't stand up straight because our spine is curved and it somehow balances our head. But then if our spine is straight, we have good posture. What's happening is all that electricity is being sent down throughout our body at 170 miles per hour to 70,000 trillion cells throughout our body. And that's one of the ways that I was able to regain the strength in my affected arm. And I'll show you maybe later that, I can hold, this weighs about 279. I can hold that. And the last thing, I wrote a book about my story. The last thing I did in my story was I ran up, I don't know if you're familiar with Negley Hill. So I ran up Negley Hill holding two 20-pound dumbbells just to show stroke survivors that it is possible to rehab your affected arm and your hand.
We've had the good fortune to talk to Rich Walters. He is a personal trainer, a stroke survivor, and I think he really fits the ethos of FitLab Pittsburgh movement, part of what makes your life complete. Rich, thanks for showing us your gym, opening up your house, and telling FitLab Pittsburgh your story.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the latest episode of FitLabPGH, brought to you by Moving to Live. Intro and exit music is Marathon Man by Jason Shaw. Check out the show notes for contact info for our latest guests, links to other information mentioned in the episode, and links to our sister podcast, Moving to Live. Moving to Live is a podcast about movement and exercise for professionals and amateur aficionados. Moving to Live offers topics from career development to coaching tips and education resources to advice for parents of student athletes. You can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Google Play, or check out our website for other subscription options. Your free subscription gets you notified when we release a new episode. Questions, comments, suggestions? Email us at fitlabpgh@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter and Instagram at fitlabpgh and like us on Facebook. If you enjoy our podcasts, please tell your friends about us and consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts. Make FitLabPGH a go-to place to learn more about movement in the Pittsburgh area. Until next time, keep on moving.